Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1, The Foundation. Lucas Ballard stood on the 42nd floor of his downtown Seattle office, watching the morning fog roll over Elliott Bay. At 35, he had everything he dreamed of as a kid sleeping on his mother's couch. Everything except the family that should have been there to share it. The irony wasn't lost on him that his app, Family Link, designed to help separated families reconnect, had just sold for $100 million. Mr. Ballard? His assistant knocked on the glass door. The Wall Street Journal is here for the interview. Lucas straightened his tie, a habit his mother Gloria had taught him when she worked 3 jobs to keep them afloat. Send them in. The journalist, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, settled into the leather chair across from his desk. So, Lucas, what inspired Family Link? It's quite personal, isn't it? Lucas had rehearsed this answer 100 times, but it never got easier. I grew up with a single mother. I know what it's like when family connections are broken. Technology should bring people together, not divide them. What he didn't say was that he'd built the app hoping his father, Richard Murray, might one day use it to find him. That may be somewhere in the digital landscape. The man who walked out when Lucas was 15 would realize what he'd lost. After the interview, Lucas drove to his mother's modest house in Ballard, the same neighborhood where they'd struggled for years. Gloria Ballard, now 58 with silver streaking her auburn hair, was tending her garden when he pulled up. "There's my millionaire son," she said, embracing him. Despite the money he'd tried to give her, she still lived simply, still worked part-time at the community center. "100 millionaire," Lucas corrected with a grin. "Don't get smart with me." She swatted his arm. Then her expression grew serious. "You know this changes nothing about what happened, right? Success doesn't fix the past." Lucas had heard this warning before. His mother worried that his drive, his need to prove himself, stemmed from the hole his father had left. She wasn't wrong. "I know, Mom. I'm not that angry kid anymore." But even as he said it, Lucas felt the familiar fire in his chest. Richard Murray had left them with nothing but debt and broken promises. He missed every birthday, every graduation, every moment that mattered. And now, ironically, Lucas had created something that could have reunited them, if Richard had ever bothered to look. That evening, Lucas sat in his Belltown penthouse, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Sound. He bought it not because he needed the space, but because he could. Because the scared 15-year-old who'd watched his father drive away with a suitcase and a shrug deserved to know he'd made it. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from friends, investors, and colleagues. But the one message he'd been unconsciously waiting for his entire adult life, from a man named Richard Murray, never came. Lucas poured himself a glass of whiskey and opened his laptop. Despite himself, he typed his father's name into Family Link's search function. The system, which had helped millions of families reconnect, returned the same result it had for years. No matches found. The algorithm was perfect. The man, apparently, didn't want to be found. Little did Lucas know that within 48 hours, Richard Murray would walk back into his life. Not with an apology or explanation, but with a lawsuit that would test everything Lucas had built, both financially and emotionally. Chapter 2. The Reckoning Arrives. The law offices of Devine and Associates occupied an entire floor of Columbia Center, with views that stretched from Mount Rainier to the Olympic Mountains. Ben Devine, Lucas's attorney and longtime friend, was pacing behind his mahogany desk when Lucas arrived for their Tuesday morning meeting. "We have a problem," Ben said without preamble. "A big one." Lucas settled into the familiar chair across from Ben's desk. They'd known each other since law school, though Lucas had dropped out to pursue his first startup. Ben was meticulous, unflappable, and rarely looked this agitated. "Define big," Lucas said. Ben slid a legal document across the desk. "Richard Douglas Murray versus Lucas James Ballard. Filed yesterday." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Lucas stared at the papers, seeing his father's name in print for the first time in 20 years. "What does he want?" $25 million, Ben said grimly. "He's calling it retroactive parental support. Claims that since you used his genetic material to build your intellectual capacity, He's entitled to a percentage of your success. Lucas's laugh was sharp and bitter. That's the most creative deadbeat dad excuse I've ever heard. It gets worse. Ben opened another file. He's retained Stuart Carroll. You know, the guy who got that pharmaceutical heiress half, her ex-husband's company. Carroll doesn't take cases unless he thinks he can win. Lucas read through the complaint, his anger building with each ridiculous claim. According to the lawsuit, Richard Murray had provided essential genetic foundation and early developmental support that directly contributed to Lucas's entrepreneurial abilities. It was legal fiction at its finest and most insulting. How did he even find out about the sale? Lucas asked. The journal interview went viral. Your success story is everywhere. Poor kid makes good, builds empire from nothing. Apparently, nothing included dear old dad. Lucas stood and walked to the window, watching the ant-like traffic 40 floors below. I haven't seen him since I was 15, Ben. He left us with $40,000 in debt and a foreclosure notice. Mom worked 3 jobs for years to dig us out. I know, and we're going to use every bit of that history to destroy this case. Ben's voice was steel. But I need you to prepare for the possibility that this gets ugly. Really ugly. How ugly? He's claiming you tried to maintain contact, but was prevented by your mother. Says she poisoned you against him. If this goes to trial, they'll dig into everything. Your childhood, your mother's finances, your psychological state. They'll paint him as a victim of parental alienation. Lucas's hands clenched into fists. The idea of his mother being dragged through court, having to justify her heroic efforts to raise him alone, made his vision go red. There's more, Ben continued. I did some digging on your father. He's been in Las Vegas for the past 15 years, working construction. 3 DUIs, 2 bankruptcies, and a gambling problem that's cost him 2 marriages. This lawsuit? It's not about reconnecting with his son. It's about hitting the lottery. Lucas turned back to his friend. What are our chances? Honestly, the legal precedent is thin, but Carroll's creative. If he can convince a jury that biological parents deserve compensation for their genetic contribution to their children's success. Ben shrugged. It's not impossible. Then we better make sure it never gets that far. Ben raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Richard Murray spent 20 years believing he was smart enough to abandon his responsibilities without consequences. Lucas's smile was predatory. Time to show him what those consequences look like. 2 days later, Lucas sat in his car outside a dingy motel in SeaTac, watching a man he barely recognized shuffle from a rusted pickup truck to room 237. Richard Murray had gained 50 pounds and lost most of his hair. His clothes were wrinkled, his posture defeated, until he spotted Lucas's Tesla in the parking lot. Suddenly, Richard's shoulders straightened, and a familiar smirk crossed his face. It was the same expression he'd worn 20 years ago when he'd told 15-year-old Lucas that real men don't cry. Richard approached the car with the swagger of a man who thought he'd played the perfect hand. Lucas rolled down the window. Hello, son. The word hit Lucas like a physical blow, but he kept his expression neutral. Richard, heard you made it big. Always knew you had potential. Richard's voice carried the easy confidence of someone who'd convinced himself his own lies were truth. Did you? Because I seem to remember you saying I'd never amount to anything. Richard laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. Kids remember things different than they happened. That's why we need to settle this thing out of court. Family shouldn't fight family. Lucas studied the man who donated half his DNA, but none of his presence. $25 million is your opening offer. Seemed fair. Split the difference, call it 15, and we can put this whole misunderstanding behind us. Misunderstanding. Lucas tasted the word. That's what you call abandoning your family. I call it making the hard choice. Your mother and I were young. Mistakes were made. But I never stopped thinking about you, son. Never stopped wondering how you were doing. The lies came so easily, so naturally, that Lucas almost admired their craftsmanship. Almost. I'll see you in court, Richard. As Lucas drove away, he caught sight of his father in the rearview mirror, still standing in the motel parking lot with that confident smirk. Richard Murray had no idea what he just walked into. Lucas had spent 20 years building walls around his heart, but his father had just declared war on the foundation itself. And Lucas Ballard didn't lose wars. He won them so completely that his enemies never recovered. Chapter 3. Building the Arsenal. The law library at the University of Washington was nearly empty at 11 p.m., but Lucas sat surrounded by towers of legal texts, case studies, and financial documents. Ben found him there, squinting at a laptop screen in the artificial fluorescent glow. "You've been here for 6 hours," Ben said, settling into the adjacent chair. "My paralegal said you've requested 40 years of family court precedents. I want to understand every angle." Lucas didn't look up from his research. "Carol's good, but he's not infallible. There has to be a weakness in this genetic contribution theory." Ben opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've got some ammunition for you. Private investigators report on dear old dad." Lucas closed his laptop and leaned back. "What do we find?" "Richard Murray isn't just a deadbeat. He's a professional one." Ben spread photographs and documents across the table. "After he left you and Gloria, he moved to Portland. Married a woman named Sonia Savage within 6 months. Had a son, Edgar. Left them when Edgar was 12. Lucas picked up a photograph of a woman with hollow eyes and a boy who couldn't have been older than 10. He did it again. Gets better. Third wife, Dolores Yu in Phoenix. Daughter named Maddie. Same pattern. Stayed until the kid was old enough to need real responsibility, then vanished. Ben pointed to another set of documents. He owes $60,000 in back child support across 3 states. "So he's not just suing me," Lucas said slowly. "He's suing the son who succeeded despite him." "Exactly. And here's the beautiful part. Sonia and Dolores are both willing to testify. They want their day in court almost as much as you do." Lucas studied the faces of his father's other victims. Edgar would be 25 now, Maddie 22. Kids who'd grown up with the same questions, the same hurt, the same burning, need to prove themselves. "I want to meet them," Lucas said. "Why?" "Because Richard Murray thinks family is just genetics and obligation. I'm going to show him what family really means." 3 days later, Lucas sat in a coffee shop in Portland's Pearl District, waiting for Edgar Murray to arrive. When a tall, lean man with familiar eyes walked through the door, Lucas felt a strange jolt of recognition. Edgar had their father's build, but none of his swagger. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. "I can't believe he actually sued you," Edgar said after they'd exchanged awkward introductions. "I mean, I can believe it. It's exactly the kind of entitled bullshit he'd pull. But the audacity is staggering." "What do you remember about him?" Lucas asked. Edgar's jaw tightened. "I remember him teaching me to throw a football in the backyard, then leaving us the next week. I remember my mom crying for months, working double shifts at the diner to keep us afloat. I remember being 12 years old and realizing that some promises are just lies with better marketing." "What do you do now?" "I'm a social worker. Specialize in family reunification." Edgar's smile was bitter. "Ironic, right? I spend my days putting broken families back together because I know what it feels like when they fall apart." Lucas felt a kinship with this half-brother he'd never known existed. "He tried to destroy us, but we built ourselves back up. Stronger than before," Edgar agreed. "You know what kills me? He's going to sit in that courtroom and play the victim. Paint himself as the loving father who was kept away from his successful son. Not if I can help it." The meeting with Maddie Yu in Phoenix was equally revealing. At 22, she was finishing her master's degree in psychology, studying the long-term effects of parental abandonment. Like Edgar, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who'd learned not to depend on anyone else. "I used to fantasize about him coming back," Maddie admitted over lunch. "I'd imagine all the reasons he had to leave, all the ways it wasn't really his fault. Then I grew up and realized that sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. He left because he's selfish and weak." "Are you angry?" Lucas asked. "I was. For years. But anger is exhausting, and it was eating me alive." Maddie stirred her coffee thoughtfully. "Now I'm just tired of him having power over my story. This lawsuit? It's his way of trying to make our success about him instead of about us." Lucas nodded. "He wants credit for the work without having done any of it." "Exactly. And honestly, I'm glad he's coming for you instead of us. Edgar and I were comfortable but not wealthy. You have the resources to fight back properly. I want both of you there, Lucas said. In the courtroom, I want him to see all three of his children, the ones he abandoned and the ones who succeeded without him. Maddie's eyes sharpened. You're planning something. I'm planning. Back in Seattle, Lucas worked 18-hour days preparing for the legal battle ahead. But he wasn't just building a defense. He was constructing an elaborate trap, one that would expose Richard Murray for exactly what he was. The foundation of his strategy was simple. Richard claimed he deserved compensation for his genetic contribution to Lucas's success. Very well. Lucas would give him an itemized accounting of exactly what that contribution had cost. In a secure storage unit across town, Lucas began assembling his evidence. Bank statements showing the debt Richard had left behind. Medical bills from when Gloria couldn't afford insurance. Report cards from the years when Lucas struggled in school because he was working part-time jobs to help pay rent. Employment records showing Gloria's 3 simultaneous jobs. But the centerpiece of his collection was a leather-bound journal he'd kept throughout high school, filled with the angry, confused writings of a teenager trying to understand why his father had abandoned him. Page after page of raw pain, self-doubt, and determination to prove his worth. Lucas had spent 20 years trying to forget that journal existed. Now would be Richard Murray's undoing. Chapter 4. The Chess Pieces Move. Judge Candace Foster had presided over family court for 15 years, and she'd seen every variety of parental selfishness imaginable. But as she reviewed the case file for Murray versus Ballard, even she was impressed by the audacity of the plaintiff's claims. Mr. Carroll, she said as the attorneys approached the bench for their pretrial conference, your client is asking for $25 million based on genetic contribution? Stuart Carroll, a silver-haired man in his 60s with the bearing of someone accustomed to winning, spread his hands diplomatically. Your Honor, we live in an age where intellectual property is our most valuable asset. Mr. Murray provided the genetic foundation that enabled his son's remarkable cognitive abilities. Ben Devine stepped forward. Your Honor, that logic would make every parent in America entitled to their children's earnings. It's not just legally unprecedented, it's morally bankrupt. Judge Foster studied both attorneys carefully. Carroll was smooth, practiced, dangerous. Devine was younger, but had a reputation for thorough preparation and creative defense strategies. This is going to be an interesting case, she murmured. Mr. Carroll, I hope you have more than genetic theory to support a $25 million claim. Oh, we do, Your Honor. Much more. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Richard Murray was holding court with a small cluster of reporters who'd caught wind of the unusual case. Dressed in an ill-fitting suit that had clearly been purchased for the occasion, he presented himself as a wronged father seeking justice. I never wanted it to come to this, he was saying, his voice heavy with practiced regret. But a man has to stand up for what's right. I gave that boy life, and I gave him the gifts that made his success possible. All I'm asking for is what's fair. Lucas watched from across the hall, studying his father's performance. Richard had always been a gifted liar. It was how he'd convinced 3 different women to marry him, how he'd borrowed money he never intended to repay, how he'd justified abandoning his responsibilities. He's good, Edgar said quietly. Edgar and Maddie had flown in the night before, and all 3 siblings were staying at Lucas's penthouse. If I didn't know better, I'd almost believe him. That's his superpower, Maddie added. He can rewrite history in real time and make it sound convincing. Lucas's phone buzzed with a text from Ben. Carroll's playing media angles hard. Stay calm, stick to the plan. But Lucas was calm. He'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, and every piece of his strategy was falling into place. Richard Murray thought he was playing chess, but he'd actually wandered into a minefield. Lucas Ballard? He turned to see a young woman with a press badge approaching. I'm Tracy Whitaker from Seattle Business Weekly. Can I ask you about your father's claims? My father. Lucas let genuine confusion color his voice. I'm sorry. I think there's been a mistake. Richard Murray isn't my father. He's a sperm donor who disappeared 20 years ago. My mother is the only parent I've ever had. The subtle distinction would be lost on most people, But Lucas had learned that public opinion could be as powerful as legal precedent. Every interview, every soundbite, every carefully chosen word was a weapon in his arsenal. That evening, the three siblings sat in Lucas's living room, sharing stories and filling in the gaps of their fractured family history. Despite the circumstances that had brought them together, Lucas found himself grateful for the connection. Edgar and Maddie were living proof that Richard Murray's abandonment hadn't doomed them. It had forged them into stronger people. "I have a confession," Maddie said as they shared a bottle of wine overlooking the Seattle skyline. "I've been following your career for years. When Family Link launched, I knew immediately you had to be his son." Ow! The mission statement. Technology should bring families together, not divide them. Only someone who'd been through what we've been through would build something like that. Edgar nodded. "I signed up for the service the day it went public. Part of me hoped." He trailed off. "That he'd use it to find us," Lucas finished. "Yeah, I built the whole thing hoping he'd eventually search for my name." "Pathetic, right?" "Not pathetic," Maddie said firmly. "Human. We all wanted him to come back, to explain, to apologize. This lawsuit is just his way of making sure that never happens." "He's not coming back," Edgar said. "He's coming to collect." Lucas raised his glass. "Then let's make sure he pays the full bill." The next morning brought the first day of testimony. The courtroom was packed with reporters, legal observers, and curious onlookers drawn by the unusual nature of the case. Richard Murray sat at the plaintiff's table in his new suit, projecting confidence and righteousness in equal measure. Carol opened with a polished presentation about the evolving nature of family law in the digital age. He cited cases involving surrogate mothers, sperm donors, and intellectual property disputes. His argument was creative, and Lucas had to admit, not entirely without merit in the abstract. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Carol concluded, "we're not here to relitigate the past. We're here to acknowledge a simple truth. Richard Murray's genetic contribution was the foundation upon which Lucas Ballard built his empire. That foundation has value, and that value should be recognized." When Ben rose for his opening statement, the energy in the room shifted. Where Carol had been smooth and theoretical, Ben was direct and personal. 20 years ago, Ben began, Richard Murray walked out on his 15-year-old son and loving wife. He left behind $40,000 in debt, a foreclosure notice, and a broken family. Now, having contributed nothing to Lucas Ballard's success, he wants to claim credit and compensation for work he never did. Ben paused, letting his words sink in. This isn't a case about genetics or intellectual property. This is a case about accountability. And by the end of this trial, you'll see that the only person who owes anything in this courtroom is Richard Murray himself. As the first witness was called, Lucas felt the familiar fire building in his chest. His father thought he could rewrite 20 years of history with a clever legal theory and a sympathetic performance. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Chapter 5. Truth and Consequences. Gloria Ballard took the witness stand with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd survived decades of struggle without losing her grace. At 58, she carried herself with the poise of someone who'd learned that integrity was the only currency that truly mattered. "Mrs. Ballard," Ben began gently, "can you tell the court about your relationship with Richard Murray?" Gloria's voice was steady, but Lucas caught the slight tremor in her hands. "We were married for 3 years. Richard was charming when we met. He had big dreams, big plans. Said he wanted to build something lasting. When did those plans change? Gradually, then all at once." Gloria looked directly at Richard for the first time since entering the courtroom. He started staying out late, coming home drunk. The bills piled up. He'd disappear for days at a time, then return with explanations that never quite added up. Carol objected to the characterization, but Judge Foster allowed Gloria to continue. "The final straw was when I found out he'd taken a second mortgage on our house without telling me. When I confronted him, he said he was investing in our future. 3 days later, he was gone. What did he leave behind?" Gloria's composure finally cracked slightly. $43,000 in debt. Foreclosure papers. and a 15-year-old boy who couldn't understand why his father didn't love him enough to stay. Lucas watched his father during his mother's testimony, looking for any sign of remorse or recognition. Instead, Richard appeared bored, occasionally whispering to Carol or checking his phone. Mrs. Ballard, Ben continued, did Mr. Murray ever attempt to contact Lucas after he left? Not once. No calls, no letters, no child support. Nothing. And how did you manage financially? I worked 3 jobs. Mornings at the diner, afternoons cleaning offices, nights waitressing at a bar. Lucas worked too, bagging groceries, mowing lawns, whatever he could find. Did Lucas ever ask about his father? Gloria's eyes found Lucas in the gallery. Every day for the first 2 years. Then less frequently. Eventually, he stopped asking and started working harder. It was like he decided that if his father wouldn't be proud of him, he'd become someone worthy of pride anyway. When Carol cross-examined Gloria, he was respectful but relentless. He suggested that her bitterness had poisoned Lucas against his father, that she deliberately prevented contact, that her memory of events was colored by anger and resentment. Gloria never lost her composure. Mr. Carroll, she said after one particularly aggressive question, I never prevented Richard from seeing his son. There was nothing to prevent. He simply chose not to try. The second day of testimony brought character witnesses for both sides. Carol paraded a series of people who claimed Richard had spoken fondly of his son over the years, who insisted he'd wanted to reconnect but hadn't known how. Ben's witnesses painted a different picture. Edgar Murray testified about his own abandonment, describing the pattern of behavior that had destroyed multiple families. Maddie Yu followed, her psychology background lending clinical weight to her observations about Richard's narcissistic tendencies. Dr. Yu, Ben asked, in your professional opinion, what motivates someone to file a lawsuit like this? It's classic narcissistic behavior, Maddie replied. He needs to insert himself into his son's success story because he can't tolerate being irrelevant to it. The lawsuit isn't about money, it's about control. Carol's objection was sustained, but the words hung in the air nonetheless. The third day belonged to Lucas himself. As he walked to the witness stand, he felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, consciously or not, since the day his father drove away. Mr. Ballard, Ben began, tell the court about the day your father left. Lucas's voice was steady, but his hands were clenched beneath the witness stand. It was a Tuesday in March. I came home from school and found him loading boxes into his truck. When I asked where he was going, he said he had some business to take care of. I asked when he'd be back. He looked at me and said, take care of your mother, son. She's going to need it. Did you understand what was happening? Not at first. I thought he'd be gone for a few days, maybe a week. It wasn't until the foreclosure notice came that I realized he wasn't coming back. How did that affect you? Lucas chose his words carefully. I spent 2 years thinking I'd done something wrong. That maybe if I'd been a better son, gotten better grades, caused less trouble, he would have stayed. Eventually, I realized that his leaving said nothing about me and everything about him. When did you stop hoping he'd return? The day I turned 18 and realized I'd become the man he never was. The courtroom was silent. Even Richard seemed affected by his son's words, though he quickly masked any emotion. Carol's cross-examination was brutal. He painted Lucas as bitter and vindictive, suggested that his success had made him arrogant, implied that his refusal to share his wealth showed the same selfishness he accused his father of displaying. Mr. Ballard, Carol said, isn't it true that you could easily afford to give your father a few $1,000,000? That this is really about revenge rather than justice? Lucas met Carol's gaze steadily. This isn't about what I can afford, Mr. Carroll. It's about what he deserves. And what he deserves is exactly what he gave me. Nothing. But don't you owe him something? Your genetic gifts, your intelligence, your drive. Didn't those come from him? This was the moment Lucas had been waiting for. My drive came from watching my mother work 18 hours a day to clean up his mess. My intelligence came from studying by candlelight when he didn't pay the electric bill. My genetics. Lucas smiled coldly. Well, let's talk about what those actually cost. Carol had walked directly into the trap Lucas had spent weeks preparing. Tomorrow, he would spring it. Chapter 6. The Invoice. The fourth day of trial began with an unusual request from Ben Devine. Your Honor, we'd like to present a comprehensive accounting of Richard Murray's actual contribution to his son's upbringing. Judge Foster raised an eyebrow. What kind of accounting? A complete financial audit of the costs incurred due to Mr. Murray's abandonment, calculated with interest and adjusted for inflation. Carol objected immediately. This is completely irregular, Your Honor. The plaintiff's genetic contribution can't be offset by. Your Honor, Ben interrupted, if Mr. Murray wants to claim credit for his son's success based on his biological contribution, then he should also accept responsibility for the cost that contribution actually incurred. Judge Foster considered for a moment. I'll allow it. This should be interesting. Lucas approached the witness stand carrying a leather binder nearly 3 inches thick. As he opened it, the courtroom fell silent. Your Honor, this is an itemized invoice for the total cost of Richard Murray's genetic contribution to my life. The invoice covers the period from March 15, 2004, the day he abandoned his family, through the present. He began reading in a clear, steady voice. Psychological counseling necessitated by parental abandonment, $127,000. Extra tutoring required due to emotional distress affecting academic performance, $23,000. Medical bills for stress-related conditions, including anxiety and depression, $89,000. Richard's face was growing paler with each item. Lost income due to time spent in therapy instead of part-time work, $156,000. Additional housing costs due to damaged credit from abandonment-related debt, $340,000. Increased insurance premiums due to single-parent household status, $67,000. Lucas turned a page. Mother's lost income due to emotional trauma and need to work multiple low-paying jobs instead of advancing career, $890,000. Interest and penalties on debt left behind, $134,000. Legal fees for bankruptcy proceedings, $45,000. The total was climbing towards 7 figures, and Lucas was just getting started. Opportunity costs associated with emotional trauma preventing normal childhood development, $200,000. Additional security deposits and moving costs due to damaged credit, $78,000. Professional wardrobe and equipment purchased to overcome socioeconomic disadvantages, $89,000. Carol was objecting constantly now, but Judge Foster was allowing the testimony to continue. And finally, Lucas said, his voice growing stronger, the cost of raising myself from age 15 to 18, including food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and educational expenses, $167,000. He closed the binder with a sharp snap. Total amount owed by Richard Murray for his genetic contribution, $1,247,000. Adjusted for interest and inflation, the current balance due is $1,834,000. The courtroom erupted. Richard was on his feet, his face red with rage. This is ridiculous. I don't owe him anything. Sit down, Mr. Murray, Judge Foster ordered. Lucas remained calm, his eyes locked on his father. You want credit for contributing to my success? Fine, but you also get the bill for what that contribution actually cost. When court recessed for lunch, the 3 siblings retreated to a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. Edgar was grinning widely, while Maddie looked genuinely impressed. That was brilliant, she said, turning his own argument against him like that. The look on his face, Edgar added, when you hit him with that final total. I've never seen anyone turn that shade of red before. Lucas wasn't celebrating yet. Carol's good. He'll have a response ready this afternoon. He was right. When court resumed, Carol came out swinging. Your Honor, this theatrical display doesn't change the fundamental facts of this case. Mr. Ballard has created a fictional accounting designed to prejudice the jury against my client. The costs he's described are speculative, unverifiable, and legally irrelevant. But Ben was ready. Your Honor, every item in that invoice is documented with receipts, medical records, and financial statements. If Mr. Murray wants to claim credit for his genetic contribution, then he must also accept responsibility for its consequences. Judge Foster studied both attorneys. Mr. Carroll, your client's claim is that he deserves compensation for his genetic contribution to his son's success. It seems only fair that he should also bear responsibility for the costs associated with that contribution. But, Your Honor, I'm going to allow the invoice to stand. Continue, Mr. Devine. The afternoon brought testimony from a parade of financial experts, psychologists, and economists who validated Lucas's calculations. Each witness drove home the same point. Abandonment had costs, and those costs could be quantified. Dr. Hannah Fletcher, a child psychologist who treated Lucas during his teenage years, was particularly effective. Parental abandonment creates a complex trauma that affects every aspect of a child's development. The long-term costs, both financial and emotional, are substantial and measurable. By the end of the day, Richard Murray looked like a man watching his own execution. His confident demeanor had cracked, replaced by the desperate fury of someone whose carefully constructed lies were collapsing around him. During the evening recess, Carroll approached Ben with a settlement offer. My client is willing to drop the lawsuit in exchange for a public statement that there are no hard feelings between father and son. Ben's response was immediate. Counteroffer. Your client pays the invoice amount and publicly apologizes for abandoning his family. Otherwise, we'll see you in court tomorrow. Carroll's face went white. You can't be serious. Dead serious. Your client wanted to play hardball. Now he gets to see what that actually looks like. That night, Lucas sat on his penthouse balcony with Edgar and Maddie, watching the lights of Seattle twinkle below. Tomorrow would bring closing arguments and, hopefully, justice. Whatever happens, Maddie said, I'm glad we found each other. Me too, Edgar agreed. He took our father from us, but he gave us something better, the strength to become the people we are. Lucas nodded, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Win or lose, he'd finally confronted the ghost that had haunted him for 2 decades. But deep down, he knew he was going to win. Justice had a funny way of finding people who'd been waiting patiently for it. Chapter 7. The Reckoning. The final day of trial arrived with an electricity that seemed to charge the very air in the courtroom. Word had spread about the unusual case, and every seat was filled with reporters, legal professionals, and curious spectators. Richard Murray sat at the plaintiff's table, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in a week. Stuart Carroll rose for his closing argument with the bearing of a general leading a doomed charge. He was too experienced to show defeat, but everyone in the room could sense his desperation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Carroll began, we cannot allow personal animosity to cloud our judgment of fundamental legal principles. Richard Murray may not have been a perfect father, but biology is biology. The genetic gifts he provided made Lucas Ballard's success possible. Carroll gestured toward charts showing Lucas's academic achievements, IQ scores, and entrepreneurial milestones. These capabilities didn't emerge from nowhere. They came from genetic material provided by my client. In a world where intellectual property is our most valuable asset, we must recognize that genetic intellectual property has value too. He paused, making eye contact with each juror. Yes, Mr. Murray made mistakes. Yes, he was absent during his son's childhood. But those failures don't negate his biological contribution. We're not asking you to forgive his parenting. We're asking you to recognize his genetics. It was a skillful argument, focusing solely on the technical legal theory while avoiding the emotional minefield of Richard's actual behavior. But Lucas could see it wasn't landing with the jury. Their faces remained skeptical, even hostile. When Ben rose for his closing argument, the energy in the room shifted. He walked slowly to the jury box, carrying a single photograph. This, Ben said, holding up the image, is Lucas Ballard on his 18th birthday. He's wearing a suit he bought with money earned bagging groceries. He's holding his high school diploma, achieved despite working 30 hours a week to help support his mother. And he's standing in front of the apartment they finally managed to rent after 2 years of homelessness caused by Richard Murray's abandonment. Ben set the photograph on the evidence table. Mr. Carroll wants you to believe that genetics created this young man's success. But genetics don't work 18-hour days. Genetics don't sacrifice childhood to pay bills. Genetics don't turn pain into purpose. He gestured toward Richard. The man sitting at that table didn't give Lucas Ballard the tools for success. He gave him the motivation. Every achievement in Lucas's life happened not because of Richard Murray, but in spite of him. Ben moved to stand directly in front of the jury. Mr. Murray claims he deserves $25 million for his genetic contribution. Well, Lucas Ballard has calculated exactly what that contribution cost, and it comes to nearly $2 million. If we're going to talk about genetic responsibility, let's talk about the full bill. The courtroom was completely silent as Ben continued. This case isn't about genetics or intellectual property. It's about accountability. It's about the bill coming due after 20 years of running away from responsibility. Ben walked back to his table, then turned for his final words. Richard Murray spent 20 years believing he could abandon his family without consequences. Today, you have the power to show him that actions have consequences, and the bill for his actions is finally due. Judge Foster called for a brief recess before jury deliberation. In the hallway, Lucas found himself face-to-face with his father for the first time since the trial began. "This isn't over," Richard said, his voice low and threatening. "You think you're so smart, so successful, but you're nothing without me. Nothing. I made you what you are." Lucas studied the man who donated half his DNA, but none of his character. "You're right about one thing, Richard. You did make me what I am. Every time I wanted to quit, I remembered that you were a quitter. Every time I wanted to abandon my responsibilities, I remembered what abandonment looks like. Every time I needed motivation to succeed, I thought about proving that your son could become everything you never were." Richard's face contorted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "The jury's back," Ben interrupted, appearing at Lucas's shoulder. The deliberation had lasted only 47 minutes. As Judge Foster read the verdict, Lucas felt a strange calm settle over him. In the case of Murray versus Ballard, we find for the defendant on all counts. Furthermore, we find that the plaintiff's claims were frivolous and order him to pay the defendant's legal fees in the amount of $400,000. The courtroom erupted, but Judge Foster wasn't finished. She turned to address Richard directly. "Mr. Murray, I've been presiding over family court for 15 years, and I've never seen a more transparent attempt to profit from parental abandonment. Your claims were not only legally baseless, but morally reprehensible." She picked up Lucas's invoice from her desk. "However, the defendant's accounting of costs has merit. While I cannot order you to pay the full invoice amount in this proceeding, I am referring this matter to the appropriate authorities for collection of outstanding child support obligations in 3 states. Richard's lawyer was tugging at his sleeve, trying to get him to leave, but Richard seemed frozen in place. Judge Foster's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Murray, let me be very clear. You will pay every penny of those legal fees. You will pay every penny of outstanding child support you owe. And if you ever attempt to profit from your abandonment again, I will hold you in contempt." She paused, looking directly at Richard with unconcealed disgust. "It seems you're the one who's going to be paying." As the courtroom slowly emptied, Lucas remained seated, feeling 20 years of anger and hurt finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. Edgar and Maddie flanked him, their presence a reminder that family wasn't about genetics. It was about choice, commitment, and love. Richard Murray shuffled out of the courtroom alone, his dreams of easy money destroyed, his reputation in ruins, and his outstanding debts about to catch up with him. For the first time in his life, he would face the full consequences of his actions. Justice, Lucas thought, was worth the wait. Chapter 8. Aftermath and Revelations. 2 weeks after the trial, Lucas sat in his office overlooking Elliott Bay, reading the morning news coverage of Richard Murray's arrest. The headline read, "Deadbeat Dad Arrested for Contempt After Failing to Pay Court-Ordered Fees." The accompanying photograph showed Richard in handcuffs, his face a mask of bitter defeat. "Serves him right," Edgar said from the couch where he was reviewing legal documents. He'd taken a leave of absence from his social work job to help coordinate the collection efforts against their father. 3 states' worth of child support, plus legal fees, plus penalties. He's looking at about $600,000 in total debt. Maddie looked up from her laptop, where she was working on a psychology paper about the trial's impact on abandoned children. The beautiful irony is that he's finally being held accountable for all of his children, not just Lucas. Sonia and Dolores are both getting their day in court. Lucas's assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Ballard? There's a Stuart Carroll here to see you. He says it's urgent." Carroll entered looking haggard and defeated. The confident attorney who'd opened the trial with such swagger now appeared to have aged a decade in 2 weeks. "Mr. Ballard," Carroll began without preamble, "my client wants to settle." "Settle what?" Lucas asked mildly. "The trial's over. He lost. The child support cases. The outstanding debts. All of it." Carroll sat down heavily. "He's offering to sign over everything he owns, his truck, his savings, his tools, in exchange for a payment plan on the remaining debt." Lucas leaned back in his chair. "How much does he actually have?" "About $11,000 in assets. Truck's worth maybe $8,000, tools another $3. He's broke, Mr. Ballard. Completely broke." Edgar laughed humorlessly. "So he wants to negotiate from a position of having nothing to offer. Classic Richard Murray." "There's more," Carroll continued reluctantly. "He's also offering to sign away all parental rights to his other children if it will reduce the debt." The room fell silent. Even from prison, Richard was trying to find an angle, a way to minimize his responsibilities. "Absolutely not," Maddie said firmly. "Edgar and I are adults. We don't need his parental rights signed away. We need him to pay what he owes." Lucas studied Carroll carefully. "What's the real offer here? Because I know you didn't come here just to tell us he's broke." Carroll shifted uncomfortably. "He wants to write a book. About the trial, about his side of the story. Publishers are interested because of the media coverage. He's offering to split the proceeds with you in exchange for your cooperation." The audacity was breathtaking. Even in defeat, Richard was looking for a way to profit from his abandonment. "Get out," Lucas said quietly. "Mr. Ballard, please consider. Get out of my office. Now." After Carroll left, the 3 siblings sat in contemplative silence. Finally, Edgar spoke. "You know what the worst part is? Part of me isn't surprised. Even now, he's looking for an angle. It's consistent, at least," Maddie said. "He's exactly who we always knew he was." Lucas walked to the window, watching the ferry traffic and the sound below. "He's never going to change. Never going to take real responsibility. This is who he is. So what do we do?" Edgar asked. Lucas turned back to his siblings. "We do what we've always done. We move forward without him." Over the following months, the 3 half-siblings grew closer, building the family relationship that Richard's abandonment had prevented. Edgar relocated to Seattle, taking a position with the city's Family Services Department. Maddie finished her degree and accepted a research position at the University of Washington, studying resilience in children of absent parents. They established the Ballard Family Foundation, focused on supporting single-parent families and children affected by parental abandonment. The foundation's first initiative was a scholarship program for teenagers who, like them, had been forced to grow up too quickly. Richard Murray, meanwhile, served 4 months in jail for contempt of court before being released on a payment plan that would take him 15 years to complete. His book proposal was rejected by every major publisher, and he eventually found work washing dishes at a casino in Reno. One evening, as Lucas was leaving his office, he found a letter slipped under his door. It was handwritten on cheap stationery, the return address showing a homeless shelter in Las Vegas. "Lucas, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know I understand now what I lost. Not the money. I never cared about that as much as you think. I lost my son. I lost 3 sons, actually, and 2 daughters. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I'm not asking for money or help or anything else. I just wanted you to know that I was wrong about everything. You didn't need me to become who you are. You became who you are because of who you chose to be. I'm proud of you, son. I know I have no right to be, but I am your father, though I know I haven't earned that title. Richard." Lucas read the letter twice, then walked to his office shredder and fed it through. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Some relationships, once broken, couldn't be repaired. But he felt no anger as he watched the letter disappear into strips. The rage that had driven him for 20 years was gone, replaced by something stronger: peace. Richard Murray had taught him one final lesson: that forgiveness wasn't about forgetting or reconciling. It was about refusing to let someone else's failures define your own life. Chapter 9. Full Circle. 5 years after the trial, Lucas stood on the stage of the Seattle Convention Center, addressing an audience of 3,000 entrepreneurs at the annual Innovation Summit. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the logo of his newest venture, Second Chances, a platform connecting disadvantaged youth with mentorship and educational opportunities. Success, Lucas said, his voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, isn't about where you start. It's about who you choose to become despite where you started. In the front row, Gloria Ballard beamed with pride. At 63, she'd finally retired from her part-time job at the community center, though she continued volunteering there 3 days a week. Beside her sat Edgar and Maddie, both of whom had become integral parts of Lucas's expanding network of social ventures. I used to believe that success was about proving something to people who doubted me, Lucas continued. But I learned that real success is about lifting up the people who come after you. The Second Chances platform had already helped over 10,000 young people find mentors, secure scholarships, and build the support networks they needed to succeed. It was funded entirely by Lucas's foundation and had become a model replicated in dozens of cities across the country. After his speech, Lucas was approached by a young woman who looked to be about 25. She had the determined expression he recognized in people who'd overcome significant obstacles. "Mr. Ballard? I'm Sarah Chun. I wanted to thank you." "For what?" "Your platform connected me with my mentor 3 years ago. I was aging out of foster care, had no family, no support system. Dr. Maddie, you helped me get into college, and now I'm graduating with my degree in computer science. I start at Microsoft next month." Lucas felt the familiar warmth that came from seeing lives genuinely changed. "Congratulations. What are your long-term goals?" "I want to build something that matters." "Like you did." Sarah paused. "I know what it's like to feel abandoned, to feel like you have to prove yourself. Your story gave me hope that it was possible." As Sarah walked away, Lucas reflected on the strange circularity of life. The pain of abandonment that had once threatened to destroy him had become the foundation for helping others overcome similar challenges. His phone buzzed with a text from Ben Devine. Saw the news. Lucas opened the attached news article with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. The headline read, "Former plaintiff in viral lawsuit dies in Las Vegas." The article was brief. Richard Murray, 58, had died of a heart attack while working his dishwashing shift at the Silver State Casino. He was survived by no immediate family and would be buried in a county cemetery. His outstanding debts, including child support obligations, would die with him. Lucas felt nothing at the news. No satisfaction, no sadness, no closure. Richard Murray had become irrelevant to his life years ago, and death didn't change that irrelevance. That evening, Lucas sat on his penthouse balcony with Edgar and Maddie, sharing a bottle of wine and watching the sunset paint Elliott Bay in shades of gold and crimson. "Did you see the news?" Edgar asked. "Yeah." "How do you feel about it?" Lucas considered the question carefully. "Honestly, nothing. He stopped being my father the day he walked away. His death doesn't change that." Maddie nodded. "I think that's healthy. We can't mourn someone we never really had." "The weird thing," Edgar said, "is that his abandonment was probably the best thing he ever did for us. If he'd stayed, we might have become weak, dependent people who never learned to stand on our own." Lucas raised his glass. "To Richard Murray, for teaching us everything about what we didn't want to become." They drank to that toast, and to the family they'd built from the wreckage of the one that had failed them. Later that night, alone in his study, Lucas opened his laptop and began typing. The True Cost of Abandonment, A Son's Reckoning. Chapter 1. The Day He Left. It wasn't a book proposal designed to profit from pain, like his father had attempted. It was a memoir meant to help other abandoned children understand that their parents' failures weren't their fault, and that those failures could become the foundation for extraordinary strength. The first chapter flowed easily, 20 years of suppressed emotion finally finding its voice. The hardest lesson of my childhood was learning that some people are incapable of love, not because of anything wrong with their children, but because of something broken in themselves. The second hardest lesson was learning that this brokenness didn't have to define us. My father abandoned our family when I was 15, leaving behind debt, disappointment, and a son who spent years wondering what he'd done wrong. It took 2 decades and a landmark legal case for me to understand that the only thing I'd done wrong was thinking his failures were somehow my responsibility. This is the story of how I stopped trying to earn the love of a man incapable of giving it, and started building a life worthy of the love I actually deserved. As Lucas wrote, he felt the final pieces of his healing clicking into place. The angry, abandoned teenager who'd once filled journals with pain and confusion was finally at peace. He transformed his greatest wound into his greatest strength, and in doing so, had discovered something his father never could: the difference between genetic contribution and genuine legacy. Richard Murray had given him DNA, but Lucas Ballard had built a life, a family, and a purpose that would outlast any genetic inheritance. In the end, that was the only victory that mattered. The boy who'd once believed he needed his father's approval to be worthy had become a man who defined worth through his own actions. And that transformation, Lucas knew, was the greatest success of all. As he finished the first chapter, Lucas looked out at the Seattle skyline, a city that had watched him grow from an abandoned teenager into someone who refused to let abandonment define him. Tomorrow, he would continue building the life his father's absence had made possible. Tonight, for the first time in 20 years, he was completely free. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.